Hey guys, I'm Joe. Thank you for tuning into my channel today. I am here with a replay against an opponent playing Infect. Looking at the opening hands, I have a one-lander with AEther Vial, so it's probably a keep. Two Cursecatchers, those guys will come out really quick. Follow up with Master of the Pearl Trident, almost regardless of whether I hit a land. And later on, the Master of Ways will show up if the game will go that long. On my opponent's side of things, he had a single land also, but with a Glistener Elf and two Gitaxian Probes, seems like a pretty strong keep for the opponent. If he can manage to have the Glistener Elf stick around, he's got Distortion Strike. Those of you unfamiliar with Distortion Strike, it's a 1 blue sorcery that gives a creature +1/+0 until the end of turn and makes it unblockable. And with rebound, it'll cast on the subsequent turn as well. So if on turn 2 the opponent makes the Glistener Elf unblockable, it'll be unblockable on turn 3 as well. And that gets really tricky when you have unblockable Infect creatures because of other big pump spells like Vines of Vastwood, Mutavault, Krosa, those kinds of things. So I think it's a pretty obvious keep for both players. Okay, so I kept, the opponent kept being on the play. I'll put Wanderwine Hub out, and having two Cursecatchers, I'll just reveal one of them to make sure that Wanderwine enters the battlefield untapped, and cast my AEther Vial. On the opponent's turn, they're going to open with Gitaxian Probe. I'll reveal my hand to the opponent, and the opponent's going to go ahead and draw another card. They hit a second land, so we can see that Gitaxian Probes can help smooth out a one-land keep for Infect. Looks like they're playing an interesting build with Ichor Claw Mirror. I think that's how you pronounce that, Mirror. I always forget. It's a 2-drop with Infect, and when it becomes blocked, it gets +2/+2, so it's really tricky to deal with in combat. The opponent cracked Wooded Foothills and gets a Forest. I guess they figure they can always get blue mana with the Misty Rainforest. They open with a Glistener Elf. And before the end of the turn, they cast their second Gitaxian Probe. I reveal my hand again. And they draw a Might of Old Krosa. So pausing this for a second, we can see that the Distortion Strike, giving the Glistener Elf unblockable, could lead to a potential turn 3 win. Next turn, the opponent will crack the Misty Rainforest for a breeding pool, cast Distortion Strike. If it resolves, the opponent can then cast Might of Old Krosa, get in for 5 Infect on turn 2, and then on turn 3, Distortion Strike will make it unblockable again, and Vines of Vastwood can make it into a 5/5 again for lethal Infect damage. So I didn't draw a land. I'll go ahead and play out this Cursecatcher, and since the opponent already knows about both of them, I'll just play the second one out right now. No tricks. So the opponent drew a second Might of Old Krosa. It's drawing very well this game. So he chose to play Misty Rainforest and crack it, bringing in a breeding pool untapped, going all the way down to 12 life. Now, I've mentioned already a couple times how Distortion Strike can work to close out games really quickly with Infect, and I don't want to let this happen, especially since if it resolves now, it's going to come back and resolve again next turn. So I decide, since this effectively counts as 2 spells, making his Glistener Elf unblockable twice and bigger twice, I'm going to counter it now by sacrificing both of my Cursecatchers. I have a lot of gas in hand. If I draw a land next turn, I'm going to be able to have 6 power on the table. The opponent's already at 12. So I go ahead and sacrifice my Cursecatchers. The opponent gets in for 1 Infect and passes the turn. For my turn, I draw a Silvergill and activate AEther Vial to bring in the Silvergill, hopefully hitting a blue source, but we see that I only drew another Lord. So at this point, I have drawn 10 cards in my deck, only drew 1 land. A little bit unfortunate, but of course it happens pretty often. Well, fairly often, not too often. The opponent's going to start by attacking with Glistener Elf, and I'm more than happy to block with Silvergill Adept. Those two creatures trade, and the opponent's going to follow up with a Blighted Agent. There's that unblockable Infect again. On my upkeep, in response to the AEther Vial trigger, I'm going to activate AEther Vial, bringing in a Lord, and then tick AEther Vial up to 3. I continue to to not hit any lands. I'm going to pass the turn to the opponent. The opponent draws an Inkmoth Nexus, which is great because it's mana and it's also another Infect creature. So the opponent's going to start this turn casting a Mutavault Krosa. Nothing I can do about that, so I let it resolve, and the opponent casts another Mutavault Krosa, making his Blighted Agent into a 9/9, finishing off the job that the Glistener Elf started earlier in the game. So that was a very fast game. I didn't hit my second land, but I don't know how much it would have mattered. This game I didn't have any Harbinger of the Tides. I drew a Spreading Seas just as the opponent drew an Inkmoth. So essentially the opponent got there with 1 damage from the Glistener Elf, and there were 9 remaining with the Blighted Agent. If I had kept the 2 Cursecatchers on the table, the Glistener Elf would have been unblockable and had +1/+0 for 2 turns, and likely would have just ended the game sooner. So that was just a very good game for Infect. So they took it. That was game 1, and we're going to go ahead and watch game 2 now. Looking at the opening hands, I've got 4 lands, 2 tiny Merfolk, and a Spreading Seas, which is very good against Inkmoth Nexus. On the opponent's side of things, we can see that it's a little bit awkward because they have a Dispel with no blue sources, but they do have 2 green lands, which is great for casting Groundswell. 2 green is needed for Vines of Vastwood. No mana necessary for Mutagenic Growth, and to become immense. So with an Infect threat in Inkmoth Nexus and all of these pump spells, including Pendelhaven as a repeatable pump effect, I have to imagine this is a keep for the opponent. And this is going to be a keep for me as well. Actually, the opponent went down to 6. That was very interesting. I have to look at that hand again. But this time, he does have access to blue mana. He has 3 pump spells and still the same Infect creature. But with access to blue mana, again, I have to assume the opponent's going to keep this. So, okay, this was an example where I'm on the play this game, but I had not yet said whether I was going to keep or not. And if you're on the draw, like the opponent is here, you're just supposed to wait for me to see if I'm going to mulligan or not. He went ahead and mulliganed ahead of me, and the fact that he went down to 6 cards made my potential mulligan a better keep, I think, just because the opponent has fewer cards to work with, so my 7 just become that much stronger. So the opponent looked at the top card of his library, decides to keep it there. Even though I may not draw a Merfolk to reveal for Silvergill Adept, I'm still going to lead with Cursecatcher just to keep tempo with the opponent. He'll start with Misty Rainforest and pass the turn. For my turn, I draw a Harbinger, which is excellent for 2 reasons. First of all, I need to be able to reveal a Merfolk for Silvergill Adept, and second of all, just because Harbinger is fantastic against Infect, bouncing their few threats that they play. So I'll get in for 1 damage with Cursecatcher now. Play Cavern of Souls because the opponent may possibly bring in something like a Spell Snare out of the sideboard. Play Silvergill, reveal Harbinger of the Tides, draw a Tidebinder Mage. So I continue to hit good cards this game. The opponent will crack his fetch at the end of turn, going down to 18, getting a tapped Breeding Pool. The opponent draws a second Pendelhaven. It's a pretty bad draw because Pendelhaven is a legendary land. And after putting Inkmoth Nexus onto the battlefield, the opponent is going to pass the turn. Inkmoth Nexus is the only creature, the only threat in the opponent's hand, and we see that I have access to Spreading Seas. So I draw a Dispel for the turn, which is great. I'm going to have enough lands to continue deploying threats, playing spells, while now keeping up mana to stop the opponent's spells. So I'll go ahead and get in for 3 damage, bringing the opponent down to 15. And on my second main phase, I'm going to go ahead and cast Spreading Seas. We can see that Harbinger of the Tides and Tidebinder Mage are both suboptimal right now. The opponent has sort of no tapped creatures and no green or red threats. So these guys are going to stay in my hand a little bit longer, but Spreading Seas will go ahead and try to target this Inkmoth. In response, the opponent is going to activate the Inkmoth Nexus by tapping itself and cast Vines of Vastwood, targeting Inkmoth Nexus, attempting to make it, to essentially give it, hexproof, I think. Yeah, it can't be the target of spells that I control. So I have Dispel, so I can go ahead and counter that. Now I have effectively neutralized the opponent's only Infect threat, and I draw into another island. Okay, the opponent draws another pump spell. You can see that Spreading Seas on his Inkmoth is probably a good play, neutralizing his only Infector. Get in for 3 again, pretty slow clock, but the opponent goes down to 12. I will follow up with a Cavern of Souls, and on the opponent's turn, bring in Harbinger of the Tides to get my clock a little bit faster. Okay, the opponent continues with really awkward draws. Just going to pass the turn. I'll bring Harbinger of the Tides in, draw another Harbinger of the Tides. We're just going to see a repeat of this this turn, next turn. Okay, the opponent draws a land, pretty terrible. I'll bring in another Harbinger, and at that point, the opponent will scoop. So pretty terrible draws for the opponent. I feel like they didn't have to mulligan that game. They essentially drew the same exact hand, -1 card, when they went down to 6. They had the Inkmoth Nexus in hand at the beginning in their opening 7, along with a bunch of pump spells, and probably should have kept that 7. So let's go ahead and watch Game 3 and see how this match closed out. Okay, the opening hands. On the draw, I have a 1-land hand with Cursecatcher and Dispel as 1-drops, 2 Tidebinder Mage, which is quite good against blue-green Infect because they play Glistener Elf and Noble Hierarch, both valid targets for Tidebinder Mages. Dispel is great against Groundswell and Mutavault Crosa and Become Immense, and of course Lord of Atlantis is good in combination with islands, which the opponent plays mostly in the form of breeding pools. So on my side of things, it's a possible keep. On the opponent's side of things, we see that he has no lands. He has to tell us first if he's going to mulligan, so I decide to keep this hand on the draw. And the opponent went down to 6. We can see he's keeping it as he's scrying the top card. He has a Forest and an Inkmoth Nexus as lands. Inkmoth Nexus, as I've mentioned a few times, is an Infector. Glistener Elf, another one, so he's got some redundancy in creatures, and a bunch of pump spells. Sort of more than enough to get lethal Infect damage. And the opponent decided to scry Blighted Agent to the bottom, not having access to blue mana. So I draw into AEther Vial. It's probably my best possible draw here on a 1-lander. But it's worth noting that I had 15 other blue sources that I could have drawn into on the draw here, and I had 2 running chances at hitting them, turning on all of my 2-drops. But AEther Vial is certainly a live draw here, and I'll go ahead and cast that after revealing Cursecatcher. Okay, the opponent's going to play Inkmoth Nexus and cast Mutavault Crosa on his Glistener Elf, already pinging me for 5 Infect. That's half of my total Infect in one swing. So I don't hit my land yet, but I do have AEther Vial. Thinking here about whether or not I want to leave up Dispel here. I do, and I'll just pass the turn over to the opponent. Okay, the opponent's going to attack with Inkmoth Nexus and Glistener Elf here. I'm going to bring in Cursecatcher, try to block his Glistener Elf. And at this point, the opponent doesn't have access to a second green mana to cast Vines of Vastwood with its kicker cost. If he casts it now, it just makes his creature untargetable by me right now. And he doesn't have enough in the graveyard, and certainly not enough mana to cast Become Immense yet. So I'm going to trade Cursecatcher for his Glistener Elf, and the opponent's going to get in for 1 more Infect damage. It looks like he might be able to get away just by leaning on me at this point with his 2 Inkmoth Nexuses. Nexuses. So I go up to 2 on my AEther Vial. I have Harbinger. It's going to be able to bounce one of his Inkmoths next turn, and realizing that I'm going to need to develop a bit of a clock, I put out Cursecatcher. Another thing that made me, another factor I should say that allowed me to play Cursecatcher was that the opponent didn't use this green mana last turn to pump one of his creatures, so it seems unlikely he's going to use it next turn. So I can go ahead and play Cursecatcher. Even if he does tap it, Cursecatcher can act as a counterspell anyway. So my plan this turn is probably to just put Harbinger out onto the table. So opponent activates, uses one Inkmoth Nexus to activate the other Inkmoth Nexus. We can see that he drew a second Become Immense, which is a little bit awkward, as he can't really cast, or he can cast the other spells, but the Vines of Vastwood would kind of be wasted at this point, just as sort of fuel for the Become Immense. At this point, as I mentioned, the opponent can just lean on me. I have no clock really right now, and he's just 4 attacks away. So I decide here to bring in the Harbinger of the Tides, attempting to bounce the Inkmoth Nexus, and rather than give the Inkmoth Nexus hexproof by casting Vines of Vastwood, it would have been a reasonable play. It would have kept his Inkmoth Nexus on the table, would have hit me for 1 Infect, and would have filled up his graveyard. I believe he allowed this to resolve. And then he just plays back out the Inkmoth Nexus. So I'm starting to establish a board presence here. Still hoping to draw a land. I do hit a land. It's a little bit awkward, but it will allow me, if I choose, to neutralize one of his Inkmoth Nexuses. So I activate AEther Vial to bring in Lord of Atlantis. The opponent seems to have junk in his hand. Seems really clogged on mana because he's got cards, but he's not playing them. So I decide now is the time to sort of capitalize and start dealing some damage. So I bring in the Lord and swing at the opponent for 5. It's going to go down to 15, and I'll just pass the turn, choosing to leave Dispel up this turn. So he draws Pendelhaven. He's going to activate the Inkmoth Nexus, and with all these cards in his hand, he decides it's time to deploy one of his kicked Vines of Vastwood. Now, to me, this sort of seems like a straight-up misplay. Cursecatcher's on the table, and I'm happy to trade this rather than, obviously, take lethal Infect damage. But I did choose to cast Dispel. Now, the only way I'm going to win the game is with bodies on the table. With the opponent tapped out, there's an argument to be made that sacrificing Cursecatcher at this point and leaving Dispel in my hand is the correct line because Cursecatcher, the instances in which he's actually useful are sort of few and far between this late in the game. I should potentially take advantage of his ability right now, leaving Dispel up to sort of counter any instant, regardless of how much untapped mana the opponent has. But Cursecatcher is doing a lot of work right now as an attacker. So I just choose to cast Dispel, especially since I left the mana up. So I'll take 1 more poison, 1 more Infect, going up to 7. AEther Vial will stay on 2, and I'll draw a 3rd land in Mutavault. And did a little bit of math here, trying to think about, with me at 7, what the opponent could do next turn. Obviously, if he doesn't draw any lands right now, he could just tap his 2 green lands, activate both Inkmoth Nexuses, and attack me for 2 poison. That'll get me down to, or up to 9 counters, but it won't be lethal. Another option, more rational option, I guess, would be to use one of the Inkmoths to activate the other Inkmoth, target it with Pendelhaven, and just deal the 2 that way, leaving 1 more green untapped. The opponent currently, let's see, another option would be if he has Become Immense in hand, which he does. He could use 1 Inkmoth, activate the other, but then he only has the 2 lands and 3 things in the graveyard. It's 1 short of casting Become Immense. Having another Vines of Vastwood, he could again activate one of the Inkmoth Nexuses and tap his 2 green to try to go in on Vines of Vastwood, but I have the Cursecatcher on the table. So all of those options don't quite get me to lethal, given that I have the Cursecatcher on board. If he draws into another land, that changes things because he can then do any number of things because, let's see, let's say that he drew a Breeding Pool. You play the Breeding Pool, use the Breeding Pool and the Forest to activate the 2 Inkmoths, and then pump one of them with Pendelhaven. That would be lethal Infect. It would be 2 + 1 for exactly 10 total. So drawing a land would be enough to kill me on its own. I have no way at this point in my hand to interact with that particular line. The opponent hits a land, activates both Inkmoths, targets one with Pendelhaven, and I lose to lethal Infect next turn. Seeing that line, I decide that it's probably going to be best to take him off of one of his Ink Moths. Another possibility is to take him off of Pendelhaven, because if the opponent draws another forest or something, they can go ahead and activate both Ink Moths, but without Pendelhaven, they'll still only be able to hit me for 2, taking me down to 9, and they'll have less access to green mana in general, which is important because they have to do things like kick the Vines of Vastwood, so they need 2 green for that. However, with that line, if they draw into another land, let's see, they would still be able to activate both Ink Moths and cast something like a Mutavault or something like that. So I just think taking one of his threats out at this point is probably the way to go. I did think this is the longest turn during the game, and I took a little while thinking about it. In the end, I put the Spreading Seas on one of his Ink Moths. I draw into a Merrow Reejerey. It's a little bit clunky, but these are really critical turns here, and the game's not going to last much longer anyway. So the opponent is going to take 7 here, 2 + 3 + 2, going down to 8. I'll have lethal next turn, so as long as he can't kill me next turn, things are looking pretty good. Let's see what the opponent hits. It's an Ichor Mirror, and having not hit a land, looks like the opponent is out of luck. He's going to activate his 1 Inkmoth Nexus and has to see that Cursecatcher's on the table, but with me coming back with lethal next turn, he feels obliged to try to resolve his Vines of Vastwood. Let's take a second to think about this and if the opponent could have possibly played defense next turn. I have Island Walk now with my Spreading Seas, and the opponent has no way to deal with the Spreading Seas. So I could simply activate a Mutavault as a 3/3, and then with Harbinger as a 3/3, and Cursecatcher as a 2/2, that's 8 alone with these guys, and I'm also going to be able to throw an extra Tidebinder Mage onto the table next turn just for extra damage. So even without the Lord, I'm going to have Overkill, Island Walk, Lethal. So the opponent's just kind of going all out here, doing what he can to win. I'm going to sacrifice my Cursecatcher here, counter the Vines of Vastwood, and at this point, I think the opponent realizes that the game is over. Although, to be fair, let me pause for a second. After having sacrificed the Cursecatcher, if the opponent chooses, well, no, the opponent has already activated the Ink Moth, so he cannot activate it and then block. So I could swing for 2 + 3 + 3 for 8. He's not going to be able to block my Lord, even though the Lord doesn't have Island Walk. So I think that's going to be about it for right now. The opponent attacks, gets in for 1 Infect, and passes the turn. Doesn't see that I have lethal on the table yet, but now he sees that I have lethal, I believe, and decides to scoop. So thanks for watching, guys. That was Merfolk versus Infect. And, you know, we saw a potentially questionable mulligan by the opponent in what I think was game 2. We see that he's playing an interesting build with this Mirror, Ichor Mirror. It's a really powerful card, but as a 2-drop that doesn't have unblockable, it's just sort of strictly worse than Blighted Agent, and it just seems a little bit clunky. It requires the 2 mana. Didn't see this guy on the battlefield at all in the 3 games, so I don't know how great of a decision it is to play this card in Infect. But yeah, we managed to get there. Tidebinder Mage didn't lock anything down, but you know, always decent as a 2/2 Merfolk. Harbinger of the Tides did bounce one of his Ink Moths 1 turn, even though the opponent could have, I think, prevented that with Vines of Vastwood. I forget if at that point I could have sacrificed a Cursecatcher to counter that or not. But it was an interesting match, and I hope you enjoyed it. Please share any comments that you have, and subscribe if you haven't already subscribed. And I'll see you in the next video. Thanks a lot. See you later.